Hello, and welcome to another deep dive episode on the Total Space Network. Today I'm taking a look at the early SpaceX history, and most of this is from the Eric Berger book Liftoff. The story of SpaceX started when Elon Musk was thinking, what's the holdup with space? 50 years ago we had gone to the moon, and after that it had mostly been regression. So he went to check the NASA website for any Mars projects, and to his surprise he didn't find anything about people flying to Mars. So he wanted to make a change himself. His first idea was to make greenhouse on Mars. The project was called Mars Oasis. So basically the idea was to buy an old Russian ICBM or intercontinental ballistic missile and use that to fly a greenhouse to Mars. And on Mars they would mix the Martian soil to Earth soil so they could grow plants on Mars on a simulant. Elon did ask a couple of times about the ICBMs from Russia, but every time he asked the price seemed to go higher. So in the end he thought it would probably be cheaper to build his own rockets. That's when he got the idea of SpaceX. And then he founded the company in 2002. After making a few hires, for example Tom Mueller, who would become the engineer on Merlin engine, SpaceX knew they had to create an engine or develop an engine. First problem with the engine was how to make a turbopump. SpaceX decided to buy ready-made turbopumps from another company. They didn't really work out of the box. They had quite a bit of problems. They made quite a few iterations before actually getting a turbopump to work. And with the Merlin engine, as Tom Mueller had been working in a company developing rocket engines, at some point the previous company made a lawsuit against SpaceX because of injector design, but in the end SpaceX won the lawsuit because they had made dozens of iterations before the final version. Tom Mueller thought ablative nozzles were easier to make and faster and cheaper, so SpaceX went with the ablative nozzle design. But surprise, surprise, they did change it along the way. While they were developing the engine, they had actually secured a launch site or a testing site at the Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, and they were building their own infrastructure for launch. They built their own launch tower, ground support equipment, everything from scratch. With pressure testing they were always running out of logs, and Elon got angry and why they didn't have enough logs. So in the end, every time they were doing pressure tests, they had a couple of extra trucks bringing in logs or liquid oxygen. Once they had the complete stage, it had a dummy second stage. Then they tried to do a static fire. It wasn't as simple, but they were able to do it. And before that, Air Force had basically agreed for a SpaceX launch from Vandenberg, but no one had really believed that. So when they had a successful static fire and were ready to launch, Air Force never signed the paperwork. Elon couldn't make a lawsuit out of it as there was no denying. They just didn't sign the papers. And at the same time, there was also $1 billion satellite waiting and a close-by pad. So that didn't help. They weren't given a date for a launch, so the thing was they were running out of money. Then they had to make a decision to find another launch site. And by the way, today SpaceX actually takes preference over some other rocket companies, even with their Starlink launches. And speaking of the other launch site, SpaceX had a customer from Malaysia, and their current design wasn't able to launch the satellite into orbit. So they basically had to launch very close to the equator to get the satellite into orbit. Then they remembered there's a military base quite close to the equator, which was located in the Marshall Islands, and more precisely Kwajalein Atoll. So they called the army, and the army was quite a bit more welcoming than the Air Force at Vandenberg. There was no launch site at the Marshall Islands, so SpaceX had to build complete second launch site infrastructure on one of the islands called Omelek Island, and people there were working crazy hours. They didn't really have any amenities there at the start. They had just a boat that took them to the island, and over the years they got some amenities like a shower. It was really far away from civilization. After a long time of working, SpaceX finally had the first rocket on the pad, and the preparations for launch went actually quite smoothly. And since they were, far away from mainland, there was no real chance of trying the pressure tests with nitrogen, so they had to use kerosene and liquid oxygen for every pressure test, but gladly all those worked out. And when they launched, the rocket lifted off well, but not too long after liftoff there was a small fire under the engine, and in the end the engine shut down and it fell down to the ocean. People were gathering the debris all over the island, and first Elon blamed the Merlin engine team, but in the end there was a few dollar nut that just couldn't take it. The nut had broken and fuel line lit on fire. After the launch one, they got some new management. Their operation turned into more professional. They were actually starting to write down every change they made to the rocket. And before the second launch, they made a list of about 15 top concerns, and there was this concern of a sloshing of second stage in some rare conditions, and that was number 11 on the list. So basically they accepted the risk and went ahead with the launch. The second launch was awesome. The second launch started well with a perfect burn of the Merlin 1A engine. The engine burned right until main engine cut off, and separation occurred, and the second stage lit up, and for a while everything was going smoothly, nominally, but at some point the second stage started to tumble, and in the end they knew there was some sloshing in the fuel tanks. So they didn't reach orbit, but as they had accepted the risk, it was pretty much a party night. They had almost accomplished an orbit. They were thinking the launch 3 would fix everything. Before launch 3, the Merlin engine team had been running into problems with the engine and their ablative nozzle. Basically, they had to replace the nozzle every time they did some testing. There was crazy ideas such as Elon using epoxy to make it last longer, but that didn't help. Then they did actually go to the regenerative engine design, and to Müller's surprise, the regenerative engine actually worked and was fairly easy to develop, and they had much more trust. And launch 3 happened from the Omelek Island again. Everything went perfectly up to main engine cutoff, and stage separation happened, but to the SpaceX team's horror, the first stage collided into the second stage, and this was due to the new regenerative engine that had such a minimal thrust they couldn't really measure it on Earth after engine shut down, but in space that minimal thrust was enough to make the stages collide. Basically, only thing they had to do was add a few more seconds after the stage separation so they wouldn't collide. But after the launch 3, SpaceX was running out of money. Basically, they had 6 weeks to launch again before running out of money. SpaceX couldn't ship the first stage on a boat because it would have taken too long. So Elon called the Air Force and somehow they were able to get on an Air Force flight that cost $500,000. The first stage was on the airplane. Everything was going smoothly until they were landing on the Kwaj Islands. Then the rocket started to implode. The pressure was too low since the Air Force had changed the operation parameters of the airplane. The team who had packed the stage hadn't really accounted for the faster landing. So after they saw the rocket is going to implode, they asked the pilots to get back up and fly around. Unfortunately, they had only half an hour of fuel left, so they had to act quickly. One of the people had to go inside of the rocket to open a valve so the stage could pressurize to the correct atmospheric pressure, and it was done. Who went inside the rocket, and it was kind of a dangerous move. If the SpaceX team hadn't been on the airplane, the military would have dropped the stage to the ocean. But they were able to open the valve and the stage stopped imploding and they were able to land. Unfortunately, the stage had been damaged, so when they got it to the island of Omelek, they called Hawthorne and made plans to get the stage back to Hawthorne and fix it there and fly it back. That didn't please Elon, so Elon said, you have 1 week to fix it. So the next night or day, the team on the Omelek Island completely disassembled the rocket in 1 day. And with such a hurry, there was of course less oversight. So that was basically more like back to the early SpaceX days. They successfully disassembled it in 1 day. Then they were able to fix the broken tanks. And within 1 week, they had assembled the rocket once again.